I've got another great writing tip planned for you today. It's about comma rules. This is one of the places where students frequently have troubles in terms of punctuation. There's lots of other punctuation issues that might go on, but commas are the ones that really cause people a lot of trouble, and quite frequently. Of course, you'll remember from your days in elementary school that a comma is a punctuation mark that indicates a pause, or that separates elements to avoid confusion. But it can be a very confusing piece of punctuation because there are lots of places where it seems like there should be a comma, but there's not. In other situations where it seems like maybe the comma is not supposed to be there, but there's just lots of confusion around what goes on with commas. But never fear, there are actually a relatively limited number of comma rules to learn, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about those, but although there are a number of exceptions. And for a lot of those exceptions, you can look at a really great source of lots of the ins and outs of commas is the Elements of Grammar, oftentimes packaged with the Elements of Style by Strunk and White. Margaret Schertzer's book, Elements of Grammar, has some pretty good examples and lots of detail about how commas can be used. But I'll just go through the very limited set of comma rules that you really need to know, sort of in order. And rule number one is to separate independent clauses that are joined with fanboys. Now, there's a lot that's going on in this rule that I want to explain, just in case it's been a while since you've had a grammar lesson. But again, rule number one, separate independent clauses joined with fanboys. Now, the first thing is fanboys. What the heck is that? Now, some of you may have heard this term. It typically refers to somebody who's a fan of, some science fiction show or something like that. But it's a really helpful mnemonic device for all of the conjunctions, or the most common conjunctions that are used to separate independent clauses. So it's for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. If you can just remember fanboys and then tag those conjunctions on, that might be very helpful for you. Now, the other part of this rule is independent clauses. What the heck are those? I sort of remember that, but so if that's you, an independent clause is simply just it's a group of words within a sentence that, if they were left by themselves, like if they was just sort of taken out as a chunk from the sentence, it could be a complete sentence all by itself. But because it's not, because it's within another sentence, it's instead an independent clause. Clause being a group of words that has both a subject and a predicate, and in this case independent, meaning that it could be a sentence by itself. So here's a good example sentence. I wanted to stop in the gift shop, but Mom said we didn't have time. Well, we have one of those fanboys in there. We have but, and then we have two independent clauses. I wanted to stop in the gift shop. If that were taken out of the sentence, that could be a full sentence by itself. And the other, Mom said we didn't have time. That too could be a sentence all by itself. So we've got those two independent clauses, and so we need to throw in that comma right in the middle of those, right before the fanboy or the coordinating conjunction. Here's another example. The dinosaurs pranced, for they had found tickets to the ball. Well, we've got another one of those fanboys. That's the F in fanboys, for. The dinosaurs pranced, that could be a full sentence, and they had found tickets to the ball. That's a full sentence as well. Well, since you've got a conjunction with two independent clauses, you need to put that comma in between. Rule number two is to separate introductory clauses, words, and phrases. And this is the one where I think I see the most confusion and sometimes the most mistakes when it comes to whether or not to put the comma. So lots of times things that happen at the beginning of the sentence really need to be set off from the main clause, the main independent clause, with a comma. So here's some examples. And again, a clause is a group of words that has a subject and verb in it, and a phrase is missing either the subject or the verb. So that's a somewhat important distinction. So a good example of an introductory clause: if he looked worried, it was because he hadn't tried the triple flip before. So in this case, we've got an introductory clause, if he looked worried. Now, and this is one, using the word if, almost always is going to require a comma, especially if it becomes at the beginning of the sentence. And then there's an independent clause, it was because he hadn't tried the triple flip before. We need the comma in there because that introductory clause is separate from the introductory part that comes there with the if. The secret for if sentences is you put the comma right before where the word then would be, because in some ways then is always understood in if sentence. So if he looked worried, then it was because. So you put the comma where the then either is or would be. We'll go on to that next one. Introductory phrase: in the rearview mirror he could see Ennis fade away. In the rearview mirror is a prepositional phrase, and the trick here is going to be the number of words in the prepositional phrase. Generally speaking, if it's 4 or more words, you'll want to use the comma. And then there has to be an independent clause in there somewhere. He could see Ennis fade away. That could be a sentence by itself. So since there's some introductory phrase in there, you need that comma. Also, some very common introductory words need to be set off by commas. Now, not all of them, but there are a certain set of common words that, if you see them at the beginning, should be set off. So in this case, nevertheless is one of those. And then you have an independent clause, the Nautilus sank. So you want to make sure to have that comma in there. So again, this is one of the more confusing ones for a lot of people. So here's a kind of list of do's and don'ts. So you do use a comma after an introductory clause. So in other words, if there is a subject and a verb in it, apart from an independent clause that comes later as the main part of the sentence, you would always use the comma. After a prepositional phrase of 4 or more words, or if there are multiple prepositional phrases in the bottom of the boat. Since there's 2 prepositional phrases that come right there together at the beginning of the sentence, you want to put the comma. After an absolute phrase, a verbal phrase, and many appositive phrases, you would want to use the comma, and also to avoid confusion. However, you don't use a comma for a very short prepositional phrase of 3 or fewer words. You wouldn't want to use it after an appositive phrase that is essential to the meaning of the sentence. Now, an appositive, you might remember, is a sort of a clause that basically mirrors another noun in there. Bob, the director of finance, had a very short tie. The director of finance is an appositive. It gives basically, it's a mirrored phrase for Bob. I mean, it's he and the director of finance are one and the same. It gives more information about Bob. So if it's an appositive phrase that's basically essential to the meaning of the sentence, then you wouldn't put the comma. Whereas if it's not essential to the sentence, you wouldn't. And also, in places where it would separate the subject from its predicate, you wouldn't want to use the comma. And this is sometimes common when you have a really long compound noun that sort of stretches on for quite a while. But this doesn't happen very often. But sometimes, you might have a phrase like, the man who wanted to be king embarked for England. Embarked for England is the verb and the object, and the man who wanted to be king is the entire subject. So you wouldn't want to put a comma after the man who wanted to be king. That's the entire subject, so you wouldn't separate that from its predicate. Okay, rule number 3 is that you want to separate non-essential interrupting words, phrases, and clauses in the middle of a sentence. So we just talked about things that come at the beginning of the sentence and separating those out. But oftentimes things will happen in the middle of the sentence that are non-essential or that interrupt the flow of the sentence and just sort of give an extra piece of information. So you'll want to ask yourself, can I move the phrase around in the sentence or leave it out altogether? That's going to tell you whether or not it's non-essential. If your answer is yes to either of those, you need to put commas both before and after the word, phrase, or clause. So here's an example. San Francisco, one of the great U.S. cities, has a cool bridge. Well, San Francisco is going to be the main subject of the sentence. One of the great U.S. cities is actually an appositive that sort of describes San Francisco, and has a cool bridge is the main sort of verb and object. So San Francisco has a cool bridge is really the main sentence. So what's happening here is one of the great U.S. cities is interrupting the flow of the sentence. So you'll need a comma both before and after it. San Francisco, comma, one of the great U.S. cities, comma, has a cool bridge. Here's another one. His hand, however, was clearly broken. However interrupts the flow of the sentence. Hand was clearly broken. You can actually move the word however in a lot of different places in that sentence. So, however, his hand was clearly broken. His hand, however, was clearly broken. His hand was clearly broken, however. So you could put that lots of different places, and because of that, it's non-essential and interrupting, and you'll want to put commas right there where that bouncing however is. Rule number 4 is that you use commas to separate words and phrases in a series. This is a relatively common one. So if you have 3 or more items that are put in a series, you want to separate those out, generally speaking, with commas. So we bought apples, oranges, and lychees. So we've got 3 items there, and we want to put commas in between the 3 items. Also, the ballerina was known for her effervescent smile, a graceful arm motion, and her skill at engaging the audience. Again, we've got 3 things that are going to describe the ballerina. There's her effervescent smile, the graceful arm motion, and her skill at engaging the audience. So we want to put the commas between the various items that are describing the ballerina. Now, unless you're told not to, you should usually include what they call the serial comma, which is that last comma that comes before the and in a series. And another important rule is if there are other punctuation marks within the items of a series, you want to use a semicolon to separate them instead. So sometimes the items in the series will have commas within them themselves. So you, instead of causing confusion between having the commas both within the items and between the items in the series, you want to separate those out with semicolons. Rule number 5 is that you want to separate coordinate adjectives that describe the same noun. Now, it sounds like a scary rule, but it's really not. I'll explain exactly what a coordinate adjective is here in a second, but you want to use a comma between those. So coordinate adjectives simply have equal status in describing the noun. So you know that adjectives are descriptive words that are attached to a noun. Coordinate adjectives are 2 or more adjectives that have equal status. So you'd want to ask yourself questions like, in terms of figuring out whether it's coordinate or not, does it make sense with the adjectives in reverse order? And can you put the word and between them? So if you answer yes to both of those questions, that you can reverse the order and that you can put and between them, the adjectives are coordinate and you need a comma between them. So here's an example. It was a gray, lonely landscape outside. In this sense, gray and lonely describe landscape. You can reverse them if you wanted to. It was a lonely gray landscape outside. And you could also put and between them. It was a gray and lonely landscape outside. So in that case, they are coordinate adjectives and they need a comma between them. Rule number 6 is when you are directly addressing somebody, you set off the name of the person with commas. So you might have a sentence like, Mrs. Dalloway, those flowers look divine. If you're directly addressing Mrs. Dalloway, you need that comma in there to set off her name as being directly addressed. Rule number 7 is that you separate out contrastive elements. And oftentimes this goes these types of things happen at the end of the sentence. So we've already talked about things that happen at the beginning of the sentence. These are things that happen generally at the end. So you should be thankful for the gift, even pleased at its thoughtfulness. You should be thankful for the gift is the main independent clause in the sentence. Even pleased at its thoughtfulness is a contrastive element. So you want to put a comma there at the end. Here's another example. Spending, not saving, is the way of the world. So this, in this case, it happens in the middle of the sentence, and it's contrasting. So spending, not saving. And so there you'll want to separate out not saving by putting in those commas. Rule number 8 for using commas is to separate elements of geographical names, dates, and the titles of people. So this is one where we use these a lot, but there's oftentimes a confusion about where commas go on the other side of geographical names, dates, and titles. So I want to show you some of the examples of this. So here's an example sentence. The sister city of Columbia, South Carolina is Brisbane, Australia. Columbia is a city in South Carolina, and Brisbane is a city in Australia. Now, to separate out Columbia from South Carolina, you use the comma, but you also always use the comma after the state name when there's more in the sentence. This is sometimes the one that people forget, but you separate out that state from the rest of the sentence as well. And Brisbane, Australia, you're separating out the city from the country. Rob Pinkman, PhD, will be our guest speaker. The PhD is a title for Rob Pinkman there. And so we want to separate out that with commas again on both sides. So between the person's name and then after the PhD to separate it out from the sentence. August 5th, 2006 was an important day for him. August 5th you would separate from 2006 with a comma, but then you also want to put the comma after 2006 as well. So if there's going to be a mistake anywhere, it's going to be that comma that comes after the state, after the country, after the title, after the date, whatever it happens to be. Just remember that if it comes in the middle of the sentence, it has to have 2 commas, not just the 1. The 9th rule is that you separate the main discourse from a quotation. So if you're using directly quoted speeches, and this is particularly important for you qualitative researchers, you want to separate out places where there are quotation marks from the main discourse of the sentence. So here's an example. Just then he said, "I can't live with this porcupine anymore." To separate just then he said, which is the main discourse, that's what the narrator or the speaker of the sentence is saying, from the quoted material, you put the comma right after said. The same thing happens within the middle of a sentence when the main discourse or the narrated speech happens in the midst of a quotation. You put maybe he pondered. You'd separate maybe from he pondered, and you'd separate he pondered from you would like farm living. So again, that main discourse, he pondered, is going to be separated out on all sides. In rule number 10, this is kind of a catch-all category, if you will. Preventing confusion is an important use for commas. I'll give you just a couple of examples. Here's the sentence, if you go, go quickly. Now what you mean, of course, is if you go, go quickly. Now somebody, however, could get confused in this sentence and think, if you go, go quickly, like go-go dancing. So to prevent that confusion, you'd want to put in the comma. Here's an example from Scherzer's book. When I was about to begin, the speech ended. Some people could get confused by running this in with when I was about to begin the speech, it ended, right? So when I was about to begin, the speech ended. That's what you really mean. And so you'd want to put the comma in there just to prevent any kind of confusion between those things. So here's a summary list of the comma rules. I hope this has been somewhat helpful in kind of clarifying whatever might be a comma rule that maybe has been confusing for you, and hopefully it'll make some cleaner writing, because the use of commas can really improve the flow of your sentences. So if you use them correctly, it can really help readers get a sense of voice from you and get a sense of sort of the poetry of your language, if you will.